You know that sound? It's it's almost background noise sometimes, isn't it? People quarreling.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe on the train, maybe next door, through the wall. You hear people arguing.
Yeah,
And it's not just noise. They're using, well, specific kinds of phrases.
that's right. And that's really the starting point for our deep dive today. They aren't just, yelling randomly. They're saying things like, hey, that's my seat. I was here first.
Or, come on, you promised me. That's a big one.
Absolutely. Or the one everyone uses. How would you like it if someone did that to you? There's an appeal happening there.
And you hear it everywhere. Kids do it, adults do it, educated people, people who aren't.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem to matter. And the fascinating thing, the thing we're going to unpack, is that they're not just complaining about something they don't like.
No, they're appealing to some kind of standard, some rule they expect the other person not just to know, but, well, to agree with.
Right. So the core question becomes, why bother appealing to a standard of fairness or decency if you don't actually believe it exists? Or if you don't think the other person believes it?
Exactly, and that's our goal today. We want to explore what this universal appeal to fair play really tells us about ourselves, about human nature. Older thinkers actually had a name for this, the law of human nature.
Right.
And by digging into why we quarrel this way, we're aiming to uncover really two foundational facts about how humans operate. Facts that are kind of hard to ignore once you see them.
All right, sounds good. So let's start by really getting into the weeds for what makes a human quarrel different from just, well, a fight. Okay, so the source material really highlights this key moment. It's not just that someone complains, like, you pushed in line. It's what the other person does next.
Yes, the response is incredibly revealing. Think about it. When someone accuses you of cutting in line or breaking a promise or taking their seat, what's the typical reaction?
Well, you rarely hear someone say, yeah, I did, and I don't care about your rules.
Right.
That almost never happens.
Almost never. If they did say that, to hell with your standard, as the source puts it, the conversation would just stop being a quarrel. It would shift.
It would become
Well,
just a power struggle.
pretty much, or just noise. But instead, what usually happens is the accused person starts doing these justifications, these explanations.
You called it moral gymnastics before we started. I like that.
Yes, moral gymnastics. They try to argue that, well, actually, what they did doesn't break the rule. Oh, I didn't see you waiting, or I thought this seat was free.
Or, and this is the really common one, they claim they have some kind of special reason, an excuse. I was in a huge hurry, or you took the better seat yesterday.
Exactly. It's different this time. Take the classic example from the reading Sharing an Orange. One person takes way more than half. The other says, hey, give me some of that. I shared mine with you.
Right.
The first person almost never says, I reject the principle of sharing. No, they say something like, well, but yours was bigger to begin with, or I only took a tiny bit more, or, but remember last week when you owed me?
They're arguing the facts, maybe, or pleading for an exception, but they're doing it within the framework of the rule itself.
Precisely. The very act of making an excuse, of trying to justify why the rule doesn't apply perfectly right now, proves that both people actually agree on the underlying rule. The standard of fair play or decent behavior or morality, whatever you want to call it.
They wouldn't bother making an excuse if they didn't acknowledge the rule existed in the first place.
That's the core insight. If they didn't fundamentally agree on some kind of right and wrong, they wouldn't quarrel. They'd just, as the source says, fight like animals. Push, shove, grab.
So the act of quarreling, of trying to show the other person is wrong according to some shared standard, that's what makes it uniquely human.
It seems to be. It's an intellectual and moral activity. It requires assuming the other person understands the rules of the game.
Okay, but let me push back slightly. What if it's just clever self-interest? What if I know appealing to fairness is a good tactic to get what I want, even if I don't really believe in fairness itself? Am I not just manipulating?
That's a really important question because, yes, self-interest is obviously a huge motivator. But the argument here is about the form the conflict takes. If it were purely about getting your way, wouldn't you just use force if you could? Or threats?
Maybe. Or maybe appealing to fairness is just a more effective, less costly way to win.
Perhaps sometimes. But think about your internal reaction. When someone accidentally bumps into you, you might be annoyed. But when someone deliberately cuts you off in traffic, knowing you were there, you feel something different.
Yeah, you feel outraged.
Indignant.
Indignation. That's the key word. That feeling isn't just annoyance. It's a sense of injustice. It's fueled by the belief that a known rule, a rule the other person should respect, has been violated. That feeling itself points to the existence of the shared standard.
Okay. Annoyance versus indignation. That's a useful distinction. Indignation implies a broken rule, not just an inconvenience.
Exactly. And the source uses that great analogy about football. You can't accuse a player of committing a foul unless everyone agrees on the rules of football beforehand. Right. The accusation only makes sense if the rule book exists and is accepted.
So the argument itself, the quarrel, the excuses, they all point to this shared understanding, this implicit agreement about how things ought to be, even if we constantly fail to live up to it.
It's like the argument is the evidence for the underlying law.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So this underlying law, older thinkers called it the law of nature. That term sounds a bit strange to modern ears, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the next crucial thing we need to unpack, what they meant by law of nature versus how we might understand that phrase today.
Yeah, when we look back at how this idea was discussed historically, this shared understanding of decency, the thing everyone's supposed to know, it was often called the law of nature.
Okay, but right away, that throws up a red flag for us today, doesn't it? Because laws of nature now makes us think immediately of, physics, gravity, thermodynamics.
Biology, chemistry.
Yes.
The laws that govern how the physical universe does operate, and that's a really important confusion to clear up.
So the older meaning was different, completely different focus. When those older writers talked about the law of nature in a moral sense, they meant the law of human nature. They were talking about the specific set of principles or rules that apply to the creature called man, distinguishing human behavior from, say, how rocks behave or how plants grow.
Okay. So it's not a descriptive law like gravity saying this is how things are. It's more of a prescriptive law saying this is how humans ought to behave.
Exactly. Think about all the different laws you're subject to right now. As a physical object, you're subject to gravity. You can't choose to ignore it. If you jump off a chair, you fall. That's it.
No choice involved. The law just happens to you.
Right. And as a living organism, you're subject to biological laws. You need to breathe, your cells metabolize. Again, these aren't things you decide to do. They're automatic, necessary processes, just like in any other animal.
Still no choice.
But then there's this other law, the one that seems peculiar to humans, the one about right and wrong, fairness, decency, the law of human nature, and this law, unlike all the others.
This is the one you can choose to break.
That's the profound difference. It's the only law governing us that we are, at every single moment, perfectly free to disobey.
Wow. Okay, let that sink in. A stone has to obey gravity. An animal has to obey its instincts, its biological programming, more or less. But a person faced with a situation where the moral law says, do this,
Can say no, or can simply fail to do it. They can know they ought to be honest, but choose to lie. They can know they ought to help, but choose to walk away.
So this freedom to disobey is actually what defines the moral nature of this law. It's a law we know, but aren't compelled to follow.
Precisely. It's prescriptive, not descriptive. It doesn't describe what we will do like gravity does. It prescribes what we should do.
And why do they call it the law of nature then, if it's about choice, not compulsion? Was it just because humans are part of nature?
The reasoning was slightly different. They called it that primarily because they believed it was known by nature, meaning you didn't need specific teaching to grasp the basics of it. It wasn't like learning algebra or, French.
It was considered innate, something built in.
Broadly, yes. The fundamental idea that things like fairness, courage, honesty are good, and cruelty, betrayal, selfishness are bad. They thought this was basically obvious to any reasoning person. Self-evident, like 2 + 2 = 4.
You might need guidance on the tricky bits, the specific applications in complex situations.
Sure. Cultures might debate the details or how principles apply in new contexts, but the core idea that there is a right and wrong, that fairness matters, that, they believed, was just part of being human. Innate knowledge.
But what about people who seem genuinely not to get it? Psychopaths or people who seem completely devoid of empathy or a moral compass. Do those exceptions disprove the rule?
That's a fair question, and the sources do address it. They acknowledge that, yes, just as some people are colorblind and genuinely can't perceive certain colors that most people see easily.
Or tone deaf, maybe. Can't hear musical pitch correct.
That's exactly. Just like those exceptions exist, you might find rare individuals who seem genuinely morally blind or tone deaf to this law of human nature.
But the existence of colorblindness doesn't mean colors aren't real for everyone else.
Precisely. The exception in this framework actually helps define the norm. The fact that we recognize someone as lacking a moral sense implies we have a standard of what normal moral sense is. For the human race as a whole, the basic idea of decent behavior was considered, and arguably still is, pretty obvious.
Okay. So we have this law of human nature. It's not a physical law, but a moral one. We know it innately, even if we argue about the details. And crucially, we're free to break it. And that's all true. Well, it has huge implications for how we judge things, right? Like big historical events, conflicts between nations.
Absolutely enormous implications,
Yeah.
which takes us right into testing this idea of universality, especially when it bumps up against the very common modern idea of moral relativism.
Right. Let's put this idea through its paces. The sources bring up examples like judging actions in wartime. When one side condemns the other for atrocities, for being in the wrong. If this whole idea of a universal law of nature was just made up wishful thinking.
Then all that moral condemnation would be meaningless noise. Just expressions of dislike, maybe, or strategic propaganda, but not actual moral judgment.
You couldn't genuinely say the enemy was wrong, only that you didn't like what they were doing.
Exactly. The very act of blaming them, of feeling righteous indignation, only makes sense if you assume that right and wrong are real things, things that the enemy, deep down, also knew about, or at least should have known about, and chose to violate.
So moral judgment implies a shared standard. If, let's imagine, hypothetically, some group of people, some enemy, genuinely have zero concept of what we mean by right and wrong. If their minds were just blank on that front.
If it was just completely alien to them,
Then could we actually blame them, morally speaking?
according to this line of thought, no. You couldn't blame them for their actions any more than you could blame them, as the source vividly puts it, for the color of their hair.
You might have to fight them to survive, sure. But you couldn't say they were wicked or evil for breaking a rule they literally couldn't comprehend?
Right. The fact that we do instinctively condemn things like betrayal, torture, mass murder, wherever they happen, shows that we operate on the assumption that the perpetrators do know better. We hold them accountable against this presumed universal standard.
Okay, but this is where the big objection comes in, isn't it?
Yeah.
The relativist argument. People look around the world, look through history, and say, hold on, look at the massive differences, different cultures, different eras. They had totally different ideas about morality. It's all relative.
And that objection has to be taken seriously. It's probably the most common counterargument you'll hear. And it's true, undeniably, that practices have varied hugely. Think about attitudes towards slavery, or lending money at interest, or how many wives a man could have, or treatment of prisoners of war. The differences are real and significant.
Very significant. So how does the idea of a universal law of nature survive that?
The key argument in the source material is that while there have been differences, these differences have never amounted to a total difference. The variations are more like different interpretations or applications of underlying principles rather than entirely separate moral universes.
Okay, explain that. What does non-total difference mean in practice?
It means you don't find a society where, for instance, cowardice in battle is praised above bravery. You don't find a culture where people admire those who betray everyone who's ever been kind to them. You don't find a place where blatant selfishness is held up as the ultimate ideal for everyone.
So the things that vary might be significant, like who you owe loyalty to, your family,
Yeah.
your tribe, your nation, all humanity. But the principle of loyalty itself is always valued in some form.
That seems to be the pattern. Or take generosity. Cultures differ vastly on expectations of sharing, but has there ever been a society that universally admired stinginess and condemned all forms of generosity? It seems unlikely.
So the argument is, if you actually compare the core moral teachings across history, ancient Egypt, Babylon, India, China, Greece, Rome.
What's truly striking isn't the differences, but the profound similarities in the fundamentals. They all teach duties to parents and children, some form of honesty and fairness in dealings, condemnation of murder, kindness to the needy. The lists are remarkably consistent.
It's like maybe the rules of the road differ, drive on the left, drive on the right, but everyone agrees you need rules for the road to avoid chaos. The underlying principle of order and safety is shared, even if the specific implementation varies.
That's a good analogy. The specific applications, the cultural customs, they can look very different on the surface, but they often seem to be different ways of trying to live out the same basic set of underlying human values or principles. The law of human nature.
So things like differing views on marriage or property rights or even warfare, these are seen as variations on a theme, not entirely different songs.
That's the argument. There are differences in how those fundamental principles like family stability or fairness or self-preservation are understood and applied in specific contexts, but they don't negate the existence of the principles themselves.
Okay, so if we accept this idea that there's a real, fundamentally shared law of nature that we all kind of know, That brings us to the really uncomfortable part, doesn't it?
Yes, it brings us squarely to the second foundational fact. We've established the law exists and is known. Now we have to confront our own relationship with it. And well, it's not pretty.
Right. So we've looked outwards at quarrels, at history, at different cultures. Now the focus shifts inwards to the contradiction happening inside each of us all the time.
Exactly. If this law of decency, this sense of ought, is real and universal, then our actual behavior creates a massive, undeniable problem because we consistently fail to live up to it.
And the proof is immediate. It's behavioral. The source points to the hypocrisy that erupts the moment someone who claims not to believe in right and wrong is personally wronged.
Yes, that's such a powerful observation. You can have someone arguing, maybe quite intellectually, that morality is just a social construct. Promises don't really mean anything intrinsically.
They might break a promise to you, maybe even explain philosophically why it's perfectly justifiable in their worldview.
Right, but then the instant you break a promise to them, you fail to show up when you said you would, or you don't return something you borrowed.
What happens?
Their immediate gut reaction isn't philosophical detachment. It's usually indignation. Hey, that's not fair. You said you would. That complaint leaps out before their intellectual denial can even catch up.
Huh. Yeah, you see that all the time. The "it's not fair" cry comes straight from the heart or wherever this law of nature resides. It bypasses the sophisticated arguments completely.
It really does. That instinctive protest demonstrates a belief in fairness, in the validity of promises, that's so deep it just can't be suppressed when they are the ones on the receiving end of the unfairness.
So we believe in the law passionately when we're the victim, but maybe less so when we're the one tempted to break it.
That seems to be the human condition in a nutshell, according to this view. And why this contradiction, why this hypocrisy? The underlying driver seems to be that we actually believe in this law of decency so strongly.
I feel its pressure.
We feel its pressure constantly. And because we feel it, we find it almost unbearable to face the plain fact that we are frequently breaking it. We don't measure up.
That's a tough thing to admit. Yes, I knew what was right, and I deliberately chose to do what was wrong or selfish. That's a blow to the ego.
A huge blow. And so to avoid that painful realization, what do? We instinctively try to shift the responsibility. We make excuses. We find reasons why our failure wasn't really our fault.
We rationalize. We externalize. The circumstances made me do it.
Precisely. And notice the incredible asymmetry here. This is maybe the most telling part. We only seem to generate these complex excuses for our bad behavior.
Ah, right. When I lose my temper and snap at someone.
You immediately think, well, I was really tired, or I'm under so much stress, or I was provoked, or I hadn't eaten. The blame gets placed on external, involuntary factors. It wasn't the real me acting.
But,
Yeah.
and this is the crucial contrast, when I manage to do something good, when I keep my temper under pressure, or go out of my way to be kind.
Do you ever say, oh, that wasn't really me. I must have had just the right amount of sleep and a perfect blood sugar level?
No, never. When I do something good, I did that. That was my patience, my generosity, my strength of character.
Absolutely. We take full credit for our virtues. We own our good behavior. But we desperately try to disown our bad behavior by blaming circumstances.
That double standard is, well, it's universal, isn't it? We use the law of nature like a weapon to judge others when they wrong us, but we try to dodge its judgment ourselves with 1,000 excuses.
We live in this constant state of internal conflict. We know the standard, we appeal to the standard when it suits us, we fail to meet the standard, and then we rationalize our failure. It's a cycle.
So this brings us back to those two foundational facts you mentioned at the start. This whole exploration of quarreling and excuses seems to boil down to two core points about us.
Yeah.
Hashtag outro. Okay, so after digging into why we argue, how we justify ourselves, the history of this idea, and that uncomfortable double standard, we land on these two inescapable points. They seem to be the bedrock for understanding ourselves, according to this perspective.
Yes, two facts that emerge very clearly from the source material. The first one is simply this. Human beings, everywhere, seem to have this strange, persistent idea that they ought to behave in a certain way. There's a standard, a law of nature, and crucially, they can't really get rid of that idea. However much they might try to argue it away intellectually, it's popping up.
It's like it's wired in. Okay, that's fact number one. We know the law. What's the second?
The second foundational fact is just as undeniable and much more challenging. Human beings, despite knowing this law, do not consistently behave according to it. They know the rules of fair play and decency, but they break them all the time.
We know the law, and we break the law. That's the core human paradox.
That seems to be it. We know the law of nature, and we fail to keep it. And we know that we fail, which is why we spend so much energy making excuses, trying to explain why our specific failure doesn't really count or wasn't really our fault.
So we're fundamentally creatures defined by this gap, this tension between what we know we should be and what we actually are.
It appears so. According to this view, we're unique in the universe in this respect. We're subject to a moral law specifically for us. We know that law, and yet we possess this unsettling freedom to ignore it. The real constant conflict isn't necessarily between different cultures having different rules.
It's the conflict inside every single person
Yeah,
between knowing what's right and choosing to do something else.
exactly. Between the ought and the eyes.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought to chew on, doesn't it? We've established this standard, this law of human nature exists, we all know it, and yet we all fail to meet it consistently. So, if this law is real, and our failure to keep it is also real and universal, what does that failure tell us? Not just about ourselves, but maybe about the nature of the law itself, or, dare I say, the lawgiver, if there is one.
That's the question that hangs in the air, isn't it? Why have a law that's universally known but universally broken? What's the purpose of this internal standard that constantly judges us, a standard we acknowledge even as we fall short? That gap, that tension between the knowledge and the action. Maybe that's the central mystery we're meant to grapple with.
Something to definitely think about next time you hear someone, or maybe even yourself, cry out, hey, that's not fair.